resistance struggles in the 20th century. So it looks at the civil rights movement in the United States. It looks at South Africa. It looks at the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. So it touches on a number of 20th century liberation struggles. It's definitely a powerful film. And then the second night, we're going to have a panel discussion with two invited guests. One of them is Adam Russell Taylor. So some of you know Sojourners outfit, right? Sort of a progressive Protestant organization based in DC, originally founded by Jim Wallace, very dedicated to civil rights kinds of issues. So Adam Russell Taylor is coming, and then Leela Prasad, who taught at Duke. Sorry for your loss. Who taught at Duke for about 25 years and is now up at Brown University and teaches on economy and sort of related subjects. So they will both be here. And so I think that'll be a really interesting pairing. And the panel structure is going to be interactional, so it will be a little bit different than just showing for a lecture. So we've got this fun movie pairing and then this panel discussion, which I think. So 7 o'clock both nights. If you can join us for one or the other or both, that's great. So please feel invited to come to that. So I've signed up for 3 weeks here of this. Hopefully you can take 3 weeks. And the way I've got it broken down is that today we're going to just think a little bit about nonviolence. What is it? So where it comes from? What are some of the cognate and related terms? Like you hear a lot about civil resistance and passive resistance, and other kinds of things. So we're going to delve into that a little bit. Then next Sunday, I want to think about, does this actually work? Right? What are some of the pros and cons? What are some of the criticisms of it? And we've got interesting things to look at there. And then in the third session, I want to think a little bit more about where it's going. How does it apply at this particular moment in time? Is there a way to put this material to work in Minnesota, for example? What would that look like? So that's the layout that I want to follow in the next 3 weeks. So today, if we're talking about the origins of nonviolence, I can't help. I mean, I have some ideas in my head of nonviolence. What sort of pops up? And let me just say, I'm fine if something bubbles up to the surface and you want to get it out there for us. Go ahead and interrupt. I'm trying to be interrupted and have to be a little dialogical. So, but I'm interested, person just hearing from you all. So when you think of nonviolence, what images, just visual images or incidents pop up or come to mind? Oh, Tiananmen Square.
Yeah, just repeat it because the people on Zoom.
Yeah, that's right. So Tiananmen Square. That's great. Let's throw this out and get something that you haven't thought of. What's the visual image there? Yeah, I was looking at this plastic bag standing on foot. And then look, you have also Selma. Yeah. Do you think of the movie or do you think of the news reports? Wow, so you were in Selma. Okay, so that stuff was all over. Yeah, I mean, I was not so much on the scene at that time. Yeah. But so I tend to think of the movie which is pop. Any other images that
Students or
right, the sit-ins at the lunch counters and well, if you're in North Carolina, those were famous. So yes, I think we have all these sort of different images that we think about when we think about nonviolence. So some of the terms that are connected with nonviolence, non-resistance comes to mind, passive resistance, civil disobedience. These are all seem to be kind of closely related terms. And if you bring Gandhi into the equation, you get a couple of terms that come out of sort of a more Indian lexicon, ahimsa and satyagraha, which are two terms that we'll talk about a little bit. In fact, the film that we're going to see tomorrow night is called Ahimsa Gandhi, the Power. So it puts that word ahimsa, which basically means non-harm, non-harming, but there's a lot in there to unpack. So we'll spend some time thinking about that. I was sorry.
Well, my question is whether the word powerless is appropriate. Because nonviolence can be very powerful too.
Yeah.
And spiritual approach to the question has also power. So I'm not sure whether the term powerless is appropriate in this particular
case. In the case, and that actually is. So the question begins to relate that to the audience: is the label powerless, which is part of the title of the movie, is that appropriate in this particular instance? Is it? I don't know that Gandhi would have seen it that way. I mean, I think he would have thought it was a different kind of power, and it's active, and it's definitely aggressive in a certain way. So we'll come back to that. That's actually very good. But I think I was interested actually that none of you said anything about Gandhi. Like when I think about Gandhi, I can't help but think about Richard Attenborough's Gandhi biography, a 3.5-hour movie. I guess it was like 1983, something like that. And people see that. I think it was, like or something. So when I think about nonviolence, it's hard for me not to think about that. And even here in the American scene, it seems fairly commonplace to think of the American civil rights movement as getting a lot of these methodologies. And so this is a famous picture. I remember this actually from the movie Selma. This is a sort of a shot. This is an actual shot. But in the movie Selma, they also have that portrait of Gandhi Jr. So we tend to think of this as something that comes to America from India. James Lawson goes over there. Howard Thurman goes over there. Howard Thurman and his wife Gandhi, and they sort of learn about Gandhi and his methods. And then James Lawson goes over after Gandhi dies. He goes back some of these and he teaches these seminars on nonviolence and then how you actually carry yourself nonviolently. Like some of these lunch counter protests that were in Nashville actually first before they were here. That was Lawson that had that particular teaching. But what's kind of interesting, I think is kind of unnoticed, is actually in the teachings on nonviolence actually sort of got their start really on American soil. So this term non-resistance is actually not Gandhi's, but actually goes back to William Lloyd Garrison. So, in a statement in 1839, William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, right, who was kind of a force of nature, it seems like, rhetorically speaking, when it came to urgency and purpose. When people heard Garrison speak, they said it was like a rain of fire. This guy, he was just, in fact, a biography of Garrison is called All on Fire. Great to know. But this is what Garrison had to say about non-resistance, and this is where I first found the term. It's a measure of sound policy, safety and property, life and liberty, public quietude and private enjoyment, as well as another kind of allegiance to him who is the king's rulers. Cordially adopt the non-resistance principle, being confident that it provides for all possible consequences, will ensure all things needful to us, is armed with omnipotent power and might ultimately triumph over every assailing force. In entering upon the great work before us, we are not unmindful that in its prosecution we may be called upon to test our sincerity even as a fiery ordeal. It may subject us to insult, outrage, suffering, yea, even death itself. And there were other abolitionist writers who were kind of saying similar things. So I found it interesting that the origins of the term knowledge is right here in American soil. And if you study up on this, experts in the field will know that another major influence for Gandhi was Thoreau and his essay on civil disobedience. Quote here from Thoreau: "How does it become a man to behave toward this American government today? I answer that he cannot, without disgrace, be associated with it. Cannot, for an instant, recognize that political organization as my government, which is the slave's government." So both Thoreau and William Lloyd Garrison are thinking in similar terms here, very different theological backstories, right? Garrison has got a very profound and detailed theological framework he's operating out of. Thoreau is working, kind of a more secular, kind of transcendentalist. So he's thinking in terms of principles of justice and fairness and so forth, without necessarily all the theological baggage. But what's kind of interesting is this tradition of non-resistance makes its way over the Atlantic. And if, again, you've delved into this stuff, well, you might know that Tolstoy, the Russian novelist, right, picked up on this teaching about non-resistance, and in fact credits Garrison and Thoreau for being articulators of this. So Tolstoy on Garrison understood that which a most advanced among the fighters against slavery did not understand. The only irrefutable argument against slavery is the denial of the right of any man over the liberty of another under any conditions whatsoever. Therefore, Garrison will forever remain one of the greatest reformers and promoters of true human progress. That was Tolstoy. And then also on Thoreau, as far back as 50 years ago, this was a letter that Tolstoy wrote to one of his friends as far back as 50 years ago, a little known, but very remarkable American author, not only clearly seeing this incompatibility between service to the state and Christianity, in his beautiful article on the duty of a man not to obey it, but also in practice showed an example of this disobedience. He refused to pay the taxes demanded of him, as he did not wish to be the better accomplice of state that legalized slavery was put in prison for it. So Tolstoy picks up these American authors, and then in 1909, the early part of the 20th century, Tolstoy and Gandhi actually have a correspondence on these principles, and Tolstoy is an influence on Gandhi, and Tolstoy dies in 1909, so it's not an extensive correspondence, but it would have gone on certainly for long if Tolstoy hadn't died. But Gandhi found Tolstoy very inspiring, and in fact, one of his ashrams, one of his social communities that he sets up in South Africa called Tolstoy Farm. So you've got this teaching of nonviolence going from America and Thoreau and Garrison to Tolstoy, and from Tolstoy to Gandhi, and then interestingly from Gandhi to these civil rights leaders in America, speaking this big kind of circuit where this teaching comes back around. I think that's kind of a fun story. So that's a little historical backstory. Let's say a little bit more about nonviolence in Gandhi and some of the language that he used, style of political protest. So I won't give you a lot of biographical details about Gandhi. I think some of you probably know this in any event, but his course of life took him from India to study in London, and then back to India for a couple of years, where he was basically a sort of unsuccessful career in India, and then shipped out to South Africa in 1893, and there was a famous incident there that actually it's in that Attenborough film. It's one of the first. It's one of the first scenes in that Richard Attenborough film where Gandhi is riding on a train. You've seen this, and he's purchased a first class ticket, and some white passenger in first class objects to the fact that there's a coolie that's riding in first class and has the authority sort of, compel him to move back to third class. And Gandhi refuses to move back to third class, but is chuck him off the train and throw his suitcase out behind him. And the train pulls off and it's just there on the platform in Peter Maritzburg, which is sort of this, I guess it's cold, it's high altitude. And so he spends the whole night in the cold there on the train platform before he can get on the train the next morning. And that personal treatment, dishonoring treatment in the film is represented as a fundamental moment for Gandhi. But it's actually kind of interesting. I was going back and looking at some of these things. And there was even a few days before this train incident, Gandhi went into a courtroom wearing a traditional Indian head garment, a turban. And the judge kept giving him the side eye about this and finally told him to take off his turban in the courtroom. And for an Indian like Gandhi wearing a turban, wearing this covering was actually it was culturally important. It was a sign of respect, not a sign of disrespect. And so he refused to take off his turban and, had to leave the courtroom. So he wouldn't take off his turban. And what I found fascinating about that is it reminded me of George Fox, who you may know as the founder of the Quakers. And one of the funny things about George Fox, George Fox and Gandhi, you can sit these guys down together, have a lot to talk about. One of the things that was a fundamental principle for George Fox is that he would not observe what he called the practice of hat honor, which in English society at that time in the 1600s, if you as sort of a lower class person were to meet a member of the gentility, you had to take your hat off as a sign of respect for this upper class person. And George Fox just absolutely refused to do that. Like if you went into a courtroom, you had to take off your hat as a sign of respect. Judges and all the. And Fox had this basic fundamental idea that there is that God in everyone. And that, in a fundamental way, it's everyone on the same level. And so to act or behave as if there is some fundamental hierarchy between people just violated some fundamental theological principle of his. So it was interesting as I was going back and preparing for this, that something like that happened to Gandhi also a few days before. This was just days after he arrived in South Africa. So this incident happened occurred just a couple days before the whole train incident. And one of Gandhi's biographers said that Gandhi, he just had an instinct for resistance. Like when confronted with things like that, he simply could not help but resist, which is not to say that after thinking about things, he couldn't adjust and compromise. So he later came to believe that maybe wearing a turban was in fact not a productive move. And I like the fact that Gandhi and George Fox and the Quakers had this, had that kind of, shared relationship and attitude towards wearing hats. So that was in 1893. That's when Gandhi first arrived in South Africa. And between 1893 and 1906, he became fairly successful as a lawyer in the Indian community in South Africa, which is very layered and sedimented between local South Africans, Black South Africans, between, quote, Asiatics, sort of immigrants from India and China, and then sort of the middle class British moves and overlords. So there was real sedimentation there in the different classes. And so there was just casual, pervasive racism of all kinds every day that Gandhi was in and had to negotiate. And in various ways was resisting, but this all came to a head in 1906 when the British decided to pass something called the Asiatic Law Amendment Act, which required all Asiatics, by which they mean Indians and Chinese people, to register and the fingerprint, just not even done, but like all 10 fingers, which was very much what was required. They had to carry papers on them at all times, and their homes and dwellings were subject to search. Like any British soldier, if they wanted to invade an Indian home, they simply could. They didn't have to knock. They just go in. And this, someone played this little video like out of the. So, this is a scene I don't know if I may have to get up. Look to see if we maybe recognize it. It's the Empire Theater, 1906. So the revelation should buy that. Yeah. Yeah. If this doesn't 30 seconds. Maybe if I just play it for the speakers, let's try that. Let's see if we can hear this.
You know, people are planning, but